Well, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Well, some of you may be familiar with some stories that start out like that. I think there's about 7 of them now. There's also a cartoon, but I'm not going to talk about those stories today, but the story I am going to talk about today begins similarly. A long time ago, in a city far, far away, this extraordinary man stands on top of a half-built wall with a trumpeter by his side, and under God's direction, he's 26 days into a construction project. And looking out over the work that's being done, he's got trouble in his camp, he's got trouble from outside of his camp, and enemies like the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites wishing to do him and the Jews harm. Now all this is being held together by a singular vision. Actions are being undertaken by this man, directed by God, and a lot of small choices. In the time we have today, I'd like to use the challenges of Nehemiah to show 3 things. Number 1, that having a vision matters. Acting on that vision matters. And number 3, every choice that we make leads us closer to God, towards that vision, or away from the vision. Now, before I get into the 3 points and the account of Nehemiah, I'd like to lay the groundwork for the big vision of why we're here. It's worth stating at the outset. And what led me to this sermonette is a theme from the camps this year, a preteen camp. And the vision of the preteen camps this year is seeing clearly in a clouded world. And it took me a while to realize, well, what were we really talking about? Seeing clearly in a clouded world, we're at camp. Is it seeing clearly to make good choices? And am I here to help the kids to make good choices? And is it the vision of what life offers? Is it the vision of their lives? Well, it was all of these things at camp, but it was none of these things at the same time. Well, you can come up with thousands of types of visions. Let's talk about one vision that underpins the 3 points I'm talking about. Let's turn to Hebrews 2 in verse 10. I've got it marked in my Bible, Hebrews 2, verse 10. While you're turning there, I'll just go ahead and read it. And I'm not going to read the New King James Version. I've got written down the New International Version because it's a little more inclusive. Bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. This is the ultimate vision for mankind, bringing sons and daughters to glory. It's worth stating that big vision for us every week. Now let's pick up the account of Nehemiah. In Nehemiah 2, in verse 4, and I asked my kids, you ever knew the story of Nehemiah? I was like, no. I picked up the story of Nehemiah when I read the Bible stories when I was growing up. I never spent much time in the minor prophets. Nehemiah 2 and verse 4 is where we're going to start out, but I want to set it up in Nehemiah 2 verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, this is about 444 BC, Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king. Ezra has returned to Jerusalem to help restore the city. Nehemiah is the 3rd wave of resettling Jerusalem. And the people were disorganized and under persecution from the surrounding areas. And the king asked Nehemiah why he's so sad. So Nehemiah is the cupbearer. He's tasting the wine for the king to make sure he's not going to get poisoned. In Nehemiah 2 verse 3, why should not my face be sad? Speaking to the king, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and the gates have been destroyed by fire. In Nehemiah 2 verse 4, so the king said to me, what are you requesting? And I prayed to the God of heaven. So I love this part where he's praying to the God of heaven. Somebody asks you a question and he immediately goes to prayer. So I guess if maybe Mr. Franks or the President of the United States asked me a question and I was about to answer him, I'd probably do a quick prayer because I'd certainly want God's help and God's inspiration in my question. In Nehemiah 2:5, Nehemiah said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. So Nehemiah's vision of rebuilding Jerusalem was first a vision in his mind, in his words, and then he worked with the help of God to fulfill that vision. So what should we do? So whenever we have a vision, we should pray and fast about how to achieve that vision. And we should continue to recast that vision, ask for God's help that he may make it possible. But we have to work for it. Now I think it's worth stating why vision is important. You don't have to turn there, but Proverbs 29, verse 18, in the Amplified Version, it says, "Where there is no vision or no redemptive revelation of God, the people perish." And the second part of this verse is as equally as important as the first. "But he who keeps the law of God, blessed, happy, fortunate, and enviable is he." Without the vision, the people perish. And we have to see something before we can shape it into reality. From a Christian perspective, vision is the ability to clearly see and articulate where God wants us to go, the choices that God wants us to make in a given situation. Vision is that bridge between the present and future reality. It reminds me of a story about a little girl who goes up to a construction site full of Christians, mind you, and they were all laying bricks, and she goes up to the first man and says, "What are you doing?" Well, he says, "I'm laying bricks. I'm laying a lot of bricks." "How many bricks are you going to?" "I'm laying thousands of bricks today." "Okay, great." So she goes to the next man. She asks the next man, "Well, what are you doing?" "Well, I'm building a wall. It's going to be a great wall. It's going to be a big wall. It's going to be tall. It's going to be long. It's going to be 1,500 miles long. Biggest wall you've ever seen." And she goes up to the third man. She asks him, "Well, what are you building?" "Well, I'm building a castle." And so you see, the difference between these three workers was that one had just a vision of just doing his job, laying the bricks every day. And the second one had a little bit of a vision, maybe not necessarily an appropriate vision if you're trying to build a wall to separate two borders. And the third man, he was building a castle to help people, to protect people. And that's the vision that kept him going. Now, you don't have to have a vision. You can just make choices to lay bricks day after day. But if you have a vision to build a castle or to bring people into God's way, bring sons and daughters to God's way, you may be able to fulfill God's calling. And whenever you're faced with challenges, you'll be able to get past those challenges. Whenever there's trouble in your way. Now, it's not enough just to be able to see. That's only the beginning. The real question, the more important question is, what will you do with what you see? What are you going to do with that vision? This brings me to my second point, which is acting on that vision. You must pair that vision with a plan and then an action. Take any successful person, whether it's a minister, a professor, your parents, research any figure in history that has left his mark on history in their field. The one thing they have in common is that they saw something in their future. And they did something with that vision. So what vision do you have for yourself, brethren? What vision do I have for myself? Developing a talent, getting married, growing in God's way, getting baptized, reading the Bible from end to end, financial success, social success. After you have a plan, you have to act on that plan. And be assured, whenever you're acting on that plan, there will be people inside your camp, outside your camp, and even yourself getting in the way. There will be challenges. In Nehemiah's story of rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, there were challenges for him. Halfway through the project, people got discouraged and wanted to give up. And justifiably given. Nobody would have criticized Nehemiah for giving up. I mean, there were people starving and people selling each other into slavery. Let's turn into Nehemiah 5. In your heading, in Nehemiah 5, it'll probably say something like Nehemiah deals with oppression in the New King James Version. And I'm going to paraphrase and jump around in some of these parts of Nehemiah 5. In Nehemiah 5, verse 1, and there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against the Jewish brethren. Midway through verse 3, they say, we have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses that we might buy grain because of the famine. And in verse 5, yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. So they're having a pretty rough time achieving God's vision. And I, Nehemiah, said to them in verse 8, according to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. We have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now indeed will you even sell your brethren? And so, or should they be sold to us? And in verse 12, everybody agrees, yeah, we shouldn't be selling each other to each other because of paying debts. So they said, we will restore it. And in verse 12, Nehemiah 5, we will restore it and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say, Nehemiah. They lost their sense of purpose. They weren't even 4 weeks into building a wall, and they had already lost their sense of purpose. And as a result, they became overwhelmed with fatigue, frustration, and fear. Well, Nehemiah rallied the people back to work by reorganizing the project and recasting their vision. Would you sell each other into slavery? He recast their vision. And these were the people that were working together. Now imagine what was going on outside the camp. Nehemiah 4, verse 16. Nehemiah 4, it talks about people outside or the world. And the analogy should not be lost on us, brethren. There's so many examples. You can cast this in so many ways. People inside the camp as the church, people outside the camp as the world, and then all the conflict in both areas. And so it was from that time on, in Nehemiah 4, verse 16, half my servants worked at construction, while the other half held their spears and shields and bows and wore armor. And those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens and loaded themselves, so that with one hand they worked construction and with the other hand they held a weapon. And imagine that you're rebuilding a wall and you've only got one arm to work with, and then those are the guys that are working. Look at chapter 20. Chapter 21. So we labored in the work, and half of the men held the spears at daybreak until the stars appeared. So half the men were working with one hand, and the other half the men weren't working, they were standing guard. And then in verse 20, going back a little bit, Nehemiah 4, verse 20, whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So, brethren, we come together and help one another like the Israelites did when the trumpet blasted. So we've got people outside the camp, we've got people inside the camp. Now we've got to deal with ourselves. So when we're chasing after a vision God has given us, sometimes no one can sabotage it more than ourselves. And it's not sabotage all at once. Well, it could be, but like really one big bad choice. But what I'm talking about is it can get sabotaged with one small choice at a time. Even though we might be acting toward our vision, we might need to pay attention to the small choices that we're making every day. Every one of us makes choices every day, and that brings me to my third point. Choices for ourselves. We make thousands of choices every week. Some of those choices bring us closer to our vision. Some of those bring us further away from God. And every choice Nehemiah made, every move Nehemiah took mattered. And every choice that you make, every move you make matters. It matters to you. It matters to us. It matters to those friends you have now. It matters to those friends that you haven't even met yet. It matters to God. And most importantly, your choices matter today, matter tomorrow, and it matters forever. So imagine the choices that we make and how they could impact or do impact those people around us, and that we might not even realize. I was talking with a lady that's visiting with us from Moscow, and as she was walking up a set of stairs, just made a choice. Made a choice to help one man with his bag. And got to the top of the stairs. She's like, "Oh, You're American. I did, but, and just going on and on and on about how wonderful it was. Well, that one choice impacted someone's perception of all of us, a whole country for that one man. So according to the best estimate I can find on the internet, the average American will meet over 5,000 people in their lifetime. Now, if you're in sales, you might meet 20,000. Well, if you're a farmer, living out in the remote area, you might, meet a few dozen. I'm just joking. You'll probably meet more than a few dozen. But point is you're going to meet a lot of people. And if you made a difference in 10 of those people's lives, and if all of us, so there's 400 of us here today, if all of us made the difference in 10 people's lives, in one generation, we would have made the difference in 4,000 people's lives. Another generation, and those 4,000 made the difference in 10 people's lives, that's 40,000. You take that out, 6 generations, 20 years per generation. I looked this up on the internet. It's really confusing. So if you ever look at generations on the internet, it's like 12 years, and then it's 20, it's 25. We're at 24.5 years per generation right now, but I'm just going to go with 20. So in 6 generations, you will have changed the lives of 400, or we would have changed the lives of 400,000 people, 400 million people, 400 million people in the United States. So 6 generations, 120 years, you would have changed the lives of a lot of people just by making an effort to change the lives of 10 people. And we're on this earth for 80 years. If you can't make a change in somebody's life every year or every decade, 8 people, that's not a lot to ask. And to give you an example, and if you think it's hard to make a difference in somebody's life, then let me give you a few examples. One man who was called by God, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, caused 42,000 people to resettle the Jerusalem area. And we're still reading about his story today. One man, Herbert W. Armstrong, was called and made a choice to follow that calling. And because of his choice, because he responded to God's calling, over 150,000 people worldwide were called to follow God's way, making an impact on everyone in this room and myself. And God can raise up whoever he wants. But he chose to raise up some people, and they responded. And we're sitting here because of the result of that. Through God's calling, our choice to respond to that calling has impacted your life and many lives around you. I think about a commander in Afghanistan. I heard a story. Somebody was given, a Navy SEAL was given a commencement address, and he was talking about, so I'm going to poach his story. I'm assuming, I didn't fact check it, but I'm assuming it's true. A man, he was on patrol, 10 men in patrol. He could go right or left, one choice. And he chose to go left. He's like, you know what, I don't want to go right. There's something wrong with that over there, so he chose to go left. Well, a few hours later, he found out that there was a roadside bomb. It killed a bunch of people. So his choice to go right or left saved him. That's one choice. Saved the men on a squad. That's 10 people. But does it stop there? Well, let's say those 10 men had 10 wives back home. And what about those kids they may have? Let's say they on average had 3 children. So that's 10, 10, 30, 50 people. One choice. So think about the choice you make to go left or right, figuratively. You can help but make a choice. You can't help but make a choice, and that choice will bring you either closer to God, further away from God, and it might even save your life, and you might not even know it. So in closing, the story of Nehemiah has so many lessons about fortitude, struggling, overcoming, and taken with Daniel and Ezra. There's a rich set of lessons that we can use as an example of what it takes to realize a vision. There's probably about 10 sermonette or sermon topics within those 3 or 4 books. Nehemiah had a vision, and he was used by God to achieve great things by acting on that vision. Our vision as God's people of the coming kingdom of God and God's family matters, and acting on that vision matters. Remember, after God's kingdom has come, after Satan is put away forever, after the great white throne judgment, after God's plan for mankind is complete and God's family is expanded, the story that you write sometime in the future may well indeed begin with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.